Good morning, lovelies. As most of you probably know, that Dune 2021 movie is coming out in a couple of very short months. And I wanted to ask, and hopefully answer, a very important question that seems to pop up whenever something like this happens, which is, why do book-to-movie adaptations suck? Why is it that whenever Hollywood turns a book into a movie, we always say the book was better, or that the story was lost in translation? Are they just bad at making movies? Well, no. In fact, I would argue that a solid half of the time, it's not really their fault. From what I've gathered, there are four major problems to turning a book into a movie: personal interpretation, time, budget, and the necessity to appeal to a wider audience. And we're gonna break all of these down. Now, problem one is personal interpretation, the subjective element of movie making. The fact is, everyone who reads a book will interpret that same book differently. A character's motivation, a setting aesthetic, a character relationships. I mean, good God, just look at the shipping wars. When you watch a movie that has been adapted from a book, what you're seeing is one small group of people's interpretation of that book. Now, sometimes the interpretation is just plain wrong, or the scriptwriters will intentionally write certain differences from the book for reasons that we will explain later, and that can be annoying. But other interpretations are just as valid as yours. But I'm sorry that I have to say this and explain it to you, but an opinion is an opinion, it's not fact. And the fact is, some people are okay with seeing other people's opinions and interpretations of a work of art, and some aren't. Like when they hire a very talented actor to play a certain character, and everyone gets all up in arms about it because the eye color is different, or their hair color is different. Pick your battles, guys. Yes, the book describes the main character with green eyes, and the actor has brown eyes and refuses to wear colored contacts because they hurt like a bitch, but is this really the hill you want to die on? Now, I personally am okay with movie makers making minor or even major changes to a story to fit their movie script, so long as it adheres to the spirit of the story. And the best example of this that I know of is How to Train Your Dragon. Now, it has been years since I've read the first book, but I distinctly remember that the dragons were not big enough to ride. They were tiny, like they would perch on the human shoulder, and they were already domesticated by the Vikings. That war between Vikings and dragons, and how the dragons would come and routinely steal their sheep and livestock and carry them, that was all new. That Hollywood made that up, but it works within the context of this story. The war highlights the difference between Hiccup and the rest of his village as he becomes the first, and for a while only, dragon sympathizer. It raises the stakes to life and death situations, which is always fun. And both the book and the movie center around the primary relationship and the crux of the story, which is a father and son struggling to bond and communicate. The fact that Hiccup is actively undermining his father, who is leading this whole war against the dragons thing, that just heightens the tension. It adds to the conflict that we all really want to see end happily. How to Train Your Dragon is probably the only movie I've ever seen that was actually better than the book. Maybe Lord of the Rings. I am so sorry, but the books send me to sleep. But again, subjective element. I'm sure many of you will tell me how wrong I am in the comments. Now, problem number two is time. Another advantage that books have over movies is that they don't have a time limit. We have a general word count that we should adhere to, but we can cram as many scenes and sequences and characters and dialogue and descriptions and anything else that we want within that word count. We're allowed to be more detailed, give more complex backstories, delve further into the world building, trace these little nuggets along. I mean, it's really fun and really cool. And movies do not have that luxury. They have to tell that exact same story within an average of about 2 hours. maybe less. This is why whole scenes or even whole characters from a book will be cut when it gets turned into a movie. Why important backstories of certain characters that change how the audience thinks of them will get glossed over or completely left out. Why the characters found key pieces of information or MacGuffins or whatever they need a lot more quickly and without the fascinating side quest that the book had. There's just no time. And here's where you get back to problem number one, because if your favorite scene or character is deemed unessential by the movie makers, well, now we have another problem. The problem of time plus the subjective element is probably why movies that have the original book author sit in on the script meetings, they're usually received better by the audience. The script writers and directors don't have to guess which scenes, elements, characters, or whatever are more important, or what their end goal is, or what their motivations are. They don't have to guess. The author is right there. They might still take it in a different direction, but usually with the author's blessing, suggestions, and conditions. This is also why books that get turned into TV shows are often better received by the audience, because they have a lot more time to play with, rather than the hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe 3 hours that a movie has to deal with. A TV show will have like 10 installments of 1 hour or 5 installments of an hour. It's still 5 to 10 hours to play with. But even if your subjective taste aligns with that of the movie creators and they have all the time in the world to display every single scene and bit of world building and scrap of backstory, you need that money. Problem 3, budget. One of the best things about writing a book is that it's free. You don't have to worry about budgeting. No special effects or expensive actors or anything like that, because it's all just words on a page. If you have a laptop or access to a computer or even just a pen and a piece of paper, you can write a story. Now, not to say that there are no expenses when it comes to writing and publishing a book, but generally speaking, you are going to spend roughly the same amount of money publishing a memoir or an autobiography that you would an epic science fiction action adventure story. Movies are very different, and in order to make money, they have to operate within a fairly strict budget. And this budget controls which actors you're gonna hire, what director you hire, set pieces, costuming, special effects. CGI has gotten very good over the past couple of years, but it's not the answer to everything. And if you decide to forego CGI and special effects and real life actors and instead just do animation because that's easier, you don't need set pieces, you just need a cool artist, that's also very expensive. Like, ridiculous. I'm always shocked at the numbers that when these producers or directors say, yeah, this one little scene with the one little guy or this one effect on these characters cost like hundreds of thousands of dollars. That whole movie cost over like $5 million to make. I'm just like, what? Movie and TV makers also have to work within the confines of, well, reality. In A Clash of Kings, the second Game of Thrones book, there's this scene where the nobles and the king and all these royals, they're mobbed by the common people of Flea Bottom. And because they are nobles and royals, they're all riding horses, which they get pulled off of, and like a mobber's trying to, tear them apart and tear their horses apart, and they have to like try to ride through this thing. It's a very intense scene. But when they did it in the show, A Game of Thrones, they had the same basic scene, the mob coming in to try to kill them all, but none of the characters were on horseback. And a lot of fans pointed out, like, why wouldn't they be on horseback? These are rich people, they're royals, you're supposed to be on horseback if nothing else to elevate your status and show off your wealth. And the creators of the show were just like, but that would have been a logistical nightmare and also extraordinarily dangerous, both for the actors and the extras and the horses themselves. But let's not give the budget too much credit here, because we've all seen those summer blockbusters that seem to have an unlimited supply of cash to give for their special effects team, but apparently not for their script writers, because yuck, those movies suck, or they're boring, or it's just whatever. So what else could be the culprit here? Problem number 4, the need for a wider audience. Now, every author is different, and the amount of books that an author needs to sell in order to make a profit is also different and dependent on a lot of factors, whether they're traditional published or self-published, small indie press versus one of the big 5, genre, and a handful of other things. Which means giving you some concrete numbers here to try to prove my point is difficult at best, impossible at worst. But let's ballpark it anyway. On average, a traditionally published author needs to sell at least a few thousand copies of their book in order to make a profit. This makes money for both themselves and the publisher and furthers their writing career. But as we discussed earlier, the cost of creating a movie is significantly larger than that of creating a book. So the amount of tickets that a movie has to sell in order to make money is in the millions, at least. So while this means that while book authors are allowed, I would argue encouraged, to laser focus on one small audience, movie makers have to go much broader, often global, with their audiences. They have to water down particularly spicy characters or scenes, because while that might attract a small audience that would be interested in the book, it would scare away much larger numbers. So the thinking goes. They see major roles going to women and people of color and LGBTQIA+, and disabled people as risky. And they stick to the tried and true method of focusing on the white, cishet, able-bodied, neurotypical white guy. And speaking of which, let's talk about the foreign market, shall we? Hollywood makes a significant chunk of money from foreign markets, not just America. In fact, depending on the studio, over half of their profits in any given year came from overseas, and that number is rising. This means two things. One, the theme or message of a movie needs to be universal, rather than just something that would be of interest to Americans, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. I mean, Pixar does this incredibly well, telling stories that strike chords in pretty much every single person who watches them, because they're speaking to universal experiences that we all deal with in one way, shape, or form. Now, issue number 2, a lot of these nations, like say China, have some very strict draconian laws on the number of and content of the movies that are legally imported. There's censorship involved. Some countries have a lot of weird reasons for banning particular movies, ranging from political critiques to not liking how the parents were portrayed in E.T. But here's what really pisses me off. That explicitly gay, blink and you miss it moment in the Beauty and the Beast remake, that pissed off Russia and Malaysia to the point of restricting access to that movie in their countries. In case you were wondering why Disney doesn't just come out and make a movie that centers around a gay couple already, they're not just worried about pissing off American conservative viewers, they would actually lose millions of dollars from overseas. And no, I am not making any excuses. I'm not letting them off the hook. I hate this. I hate all of this. I despise the fact that if someone in Hollywood wants to make a story that just features an LGBTQIA+ character, they're gonna be roadblocked by all the other creators who just want to make money. I hate that if someone wants to make a movie and make a profit, they have to play by a dozen countries' arbitrary rules. And I hate that there's not much we can do to change that other than what we're already doing. Gradually pushing for more inclusion and diversity in every story everywhere we go. But this is an issue for another video. Right now we need to focus on the actual reason I created this video in the first place, which is how worried should we be about Dune? Now, all these factors, subjectivity, time, budget, and the need for a wider audience, they come out in full force when you're trying to make a movie out of a classic piece of literature like Dune, because the stakes are so much higher. Now, we have successfully turned classical books into good movies before. Lord of the Rings is my favorite example of this. The Hobbit, not so much. So let's take a gamble on how well they'll do with Dune. From what I've seen in the previews, they're sticking relatively close to the source material. I've heard entire bits of dialogue, whole scenes, I mean, losing the factory to the worms, the overthrow of the family, the torture box, the prophesized war, I mean, all of it. Now, of course, we have been fooled by previews before, but this is a good sign. I'm not seeing any red flags in the preview itself. In terms of time, they are splitting this story into 2 movies, which gives them more wiggle room and more to maneuver. And honestly, considering how dense this book is, seemed like a pretty smart move. I just hope they don't do what they did with The Hobbit, which is decide, you know what, we can squeeze another few $1 million off of this, let's make a 3rd movie. Like, no, The Hobbit should have been 2 minutes. Honestly, it could have been 1 movie. I mean, that book is tiny, but at most, it should have been 2 movies. Dune has a bit more chunk in it, so 2 movies seems like a better idea. Budget, I'm not worried. They've got Denis Villeneuve directing this thing, and he knows how to use one of those. He also has experience with book-to-movie adaptations, specifically science fiction book-to-movie adaptations. So, I mean, that's a pretty good choice. I guess my biggest worry about this film is the same one that I have with every movie that I want to see, and that is, what about the minority groups, especially the women? Dune came out in 1965, and it has a surprisingly high amount of women with autonomy and complex characters and badass scenes. I mean, Jessica blew me away, and Paul's little sister is like adorable and weird and kind of creepy, but also really cool. But Hollywood does not have a good reputation with portraying women characters. Rightfully so. Now, at the time that I'm making this video, the first couple of reviews have already come in, and they have been positive. So we may just be fretting about this over nothing. I still refuse to get my hopes up. Those are the 4 major obstacles of turning a book into a movie. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. If you're late to the party and you're wondering what the heck is with this whole Dune fever, what's it even about, can I just, you know, watch a really short summary of the whole book so I kind of know what I'm dealing with? I got you. I did a summary of Dune that you can see right here, back before I learned how to actually look at camera in the lens rather than at my script every 10 seconds. I'll see you next time. Bye, lovelies!